Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar in the SERDP and ESTCP webinar series. I am Jennifer Nyman. I'm a senior principal at Geosyntec Consultants in California and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's event. The webinar today focuses on federally funded research efforts to support transition to electric vehicles on military installations. First, Cabell Hodge of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory will present the development of an electric vehicle charging station site design tool. Second, Frank Holcomb of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will discuss a broad strategic effort to develop a planning framework for non-tactical vehicle fleet electrification with stakeholder input. Each presentation will be followed by a brief question and answer session, and we will conclude the webinar today with a Q&A session with both of our speakers. The next few slides provide some instructions on optimizing your webinar experience. If you haven't done so already, you can download Zoom at the link shown here and given to you in your registration email. If you cannot download Zoom, you can still view the slides using an internet browser like Firefox or Edge and by creating a free Zoom account. If you still are unable to view the slides or if your screen freezes, you can always try keying in Control and F5, and that performs a hard refresh. If you are having any audio difficulties and you're accessing the audio through your computer, you can click on the arrow next to the Join Audio button and select Test Speaker and Microphone, and then follow the prompts as they appear on your screen. If you continue to experience difficulties, you can call into the conference line shown here. For technical difficulties, you can also submit a comment using the chat box in Zoom, but please use that chat box only for comments related to technical difficulties. The Q&A option in Zoom is reserved for questions for the speakers. And in case of continued technical difficulties, you can always download a PDF of the slides at the link shown here, and then you can call into the conference line. We will also be streaming the webinar on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here. Today's broadcast is listen only. You can submit questions by using the Q&A box on your screen. You don't need to wait until that Q&A period to submit your questions. It would be great if you submitted questions in advance of that session. And when you submit your questions, please make sure to add your organizational name at the end of your question. And with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Timothy Tatro, who is the ESTCP Program Manager for Installation, Energy, and Water. Before joining SERDP and ESTCP, Tim worked at the National Renewable Energy Lab, where he focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy project development for the federal sector. Tim, please proceed.
All right, thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everybody to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. I've got a few slides to run through before we go back to the presentation. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between DoD, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on DoD requirements. And SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impact real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs with much of SERDP research occurring in the lab and at pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, although occasionally their supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are several environmental drivers for the type of work funded under SERDP and ESTCP with the underlying objective of sustaining DoD ranges, facilities, and operations. This, as you can imagine, is a broad undertaking. takes the form of looking at maritime sustainability, threatened and endangered species, climate impacts, unexploded ordnances, and munitions constituents, as well as other environmental drivers. One key environmental driver is the reduction of current and future environmental liabilities. This involves addressing contamination from past practices, including impacts to groundwater, soils, and sediments, unexploded ordnance contamination, and development management approaches for contaminants of emerging concern. The second part of this is pollution prevention, which focus on eliminating chemicals of concern or hazardous materials in manufacturing, maintenance, and operations on our installations. We have several main focus areas of research and demonstration in SERDP and ESTCP shown here. As mentioned earlier, technology transfer is particularly important within SERDP and ESTCP programs. Technology transfer efforts include the development of videos, training workshops, and guidance documents. The webinar series is a substantial component of our technology transfer efforts. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from all of our program areas. And upcoming topics include alternative coating and plating technologies for corrosion and repair, conservation efforts for managing populations of threatened and endangered species, enhanced sensing for detailed surveys for munitions detection and localization of very shallow water, and forensic methods for PFAS source tracking and allocation. Registration is open for webinars through the beginning of next year. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link here, and all past webinars are archived and can be accessed using this link. And please save the date for the upcoming 2023 symposium, which will be held between Tuesday, November 28th and Friday, December 1st in Arlington, Virginia. You can register for symposium and view the program agenda at the link shown here. And finally, I would like to remind you that a copy of today's presentation can be accessed on our web page and downloaded. And we would appreciate if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jennifer, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. Now, my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Cabell Hodge. In addition to other national and international efforts, he serves as the Federal Fleet Project Leader for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's support for federal fleet electrification. He conducts research on fleet electrification, electrical vehicle supply equipment installation, charging management, vehicle grid integration, battery electric buses, telematics, and vehicle cybersecurity. Before joining NREL, Mr. Hodge was a policy advisor at the Colorado Energy Office, where he developed programs and policies to deploy alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Syracuse University and a JD in graduate energy certificate from the University of Colorado Law School. Cabell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon to those of you guys on the East Coast, and good morning to those of us in Rocky Mountain Pacific Time and Central. I'm going to talk today about EVI-LOCATE. EVI-LOCATE is an electric vehicle charging station site design tool that we've been working very hard on for the past year and a half at this point. I am trying to toggle the slides, but if you want to jump to the next one, that'd be great. So the background of the tool is that this is the presentation outline. I'm going to talk about the background, how to use EVI-LOCATE, as well as the benefits to DoD. This is the link to the tool. Unfortunately, I was feeling ambitious about when the tool would get through our cybersecurity approval process. It is not through that process, and so currently it is not available outside of NREL. If you are at NREL, of course, you can use this tool and take a look at it. If not, feel free to reach out to me directly, and my contact information will be at the end, and hopefully I can give you an update in terms of when that tool will actually be available. So slide 21. The problem statement is what we were trying to address here. And it's the current EVSE site assessment process requires in-person visits with disparate sets of assumptions, approaches, and reporting processes. In a nutshell, a whole bunch of different people were going to a whole bunch of different places and trying to plan for EVSE in a whole bunch of different ways. Our objective is to standardize that process with the EVI-LOCATE web tool, make it much easier by asking the questions that need to be answered in order to install the charging station equipment, and simplify the entire process so that many more folks could do this and you don't necessarily need a set of experts on site. There is no tool that is currently configured to draw engineering plans or to generate cost estimates specifically for EVSE. So this is the first of its kind to my knowledge, and we are building it just for you guys in the federal government. Slide 22. The tool is designed to 1, plan the charging station deployments, 2, assess electrical needs, and 3, calculate project costs. And I'm going to talk today about how each of those things are tied together in their own sort of way. So slide 23. This is the tool, and it shows you what the output sort of looks like. Basically, it's a drag and drop tool where you are going to drop the icons into a parking lot, and the tool is going to route the electrical runs for you. It's going to walk you through whether your existing transformer has sufficient capacity, whether you need a new service panel, and it's going to be able to provide you those runs. So these are all of the sort of icons that you can see, and basically all of the things that are addressed within EVI-LOCATE. In red, you see a whole bunch of electrical equipment, starting with pad-mounted transformers, also including the pole-mounted transformers, meters, a separate control panel, and then a service panel. In the blue, so that medium blue is for level 2 chargers and stub-ups. The dark blue is for DC fast chargers, and the light blue is for level 1 chargers. Then we've got these green icons to designate whether spaces are for privately owned vehicles or government owned vehicles, or if they are for handicap spots. We've actually changed how that handicap thing is incorporated, so you can now see that as part of the charger itself. Kind of makes it a little bit easier to look at on a map. Next slide, please. Behind the scenes, there is a siting algorithm that's used to distinguish hardscape and softscape. And the reason that matters is because we want to determine the least cost path to run conductors and conduit. So if you look at this near infrared imagery on the right, you'll see way down there, there's a little icon for a transformer, and that's actually connecting to a charging station icon. Rather than running that directly through the middle of the parking lot, the tool is smart enough to know that you should run the wires around the outside of that parking lot. And that is ideally how you would do it, so that you disturb the hardscape as little as possible. I will say we can see what the infrared imagery will tell us, but we cannot see under the ground. So we are working on building in the capacity for users to modify the wiring path. It's not in there right now. Slide 25. I'm going to take you through a tour of the site. So slide 26 is going to get into that. And you're going to start with a login screen, a home screen that's going to tell you what the tool is and what it does. I've already sort of described it, but it's this comprehensive design tool to help you get started with your EVSE deployment plans. There are some things that you need in order to get started. You need to know how many charging ports and power and the power level of the charging ports you would like. If you're interested in talking about how to come up with those, we actually have another tool set that helps you figure that out. Specifically, EVI ratio helps you calculate how many chargers you need for a fleet of electric vehicles. You also need some information on existing utility assets, such as transformers and service panels. However, if you don't have that information, you are able to revisit that either with us by contacting us directly, or you can just assume that you will need this equipment, put that into your cost estimate, run that up the chain. EVI-LOCATE is currently available only to federal users with a valid email address. So there will be a login screen right here, and you'll be able to sign up for a new account. Next slide, please. As part of signing up that account, you will identify which agency you are a part of, and you will be able to see the designs that have been developed within your agency, but not outside of it. And so an agency for these purposes would be a service such as Army, Navy, or Marine Corps. It would not be all of Department of Defense. As part of the tool, once you're in there, you can actually plan for locations that aren't necessarily your specific location, as long as you're within your agency. So probably going to get rid of this part here, where it's which type of agency are you, and then go directly to the selecting your area cost factor for the Department of Defense. This uses the Army Corps of Engineers area cost factor that is updated on an annual basis and is going to be specific to each individual location. So you will pick either, in this case, Colorado Air Force Academy, or you will be able to just pick the closest location to where you are actually installing your EVSE. Slide 28, please. In order to define a site and not convolute the tool, you need to draw a polygon around the EV parking area. And so that's the next part of the tool. And this is a polygon that is supposed to, any sort of shape really you can draw here. The critical part of this is that all of your EVSE needs to be inside that shape, as well as the transformer and the service panel. That way the tool can actually identify it as part of this particular design, and then you go ahead and name your site. So I looked, for the purposes of this presentation, at a high school near my house, Pomona High. And so this is Pomona Test Site, and that's the example that I'll be bringing you through. Next slide. The next step in the process is to select an EV charger. We have this set up so that all options from the GSA blanket purchase agreement are available in the tool. And if you're not familiar with the GSA blanket purchase agreement, GSA has pre-competed basically all of the EVSE companies out there by sending them all a notice and asking them to provide their best prices on their equipment. And so we can leverage that by using their filters. So if we want a level 2 charger, perhaps you want a wall mount, perhaps you want a pedestal mount charger, perhaps you want a single port, maybe a dual port. In this case, whether you want it networked or not, you can pick yes or no. And then that's going to lead you to the manufacturer and the model. Next slide. You can also pick a generic charger as part of that. And so you could select, I want just your average level 2 charger, and we will fill in all of the average values for you. Then you're going to go ahead and drop the chargers on the map. Users can select multiple configurations for this. So if they want one level 2 that's pedestal mounted, another one that's wall mounted, they can do that. Some that are networked, some that aren't for some reason, you could do that. The most applicable place I think this comes in is with the handicap. So say you want to install 10 level 2 chargers, but you want one of them to be handicap designated. You can go back and designate that one charging station as handicap, maybe put it in a different place and locate it appropriately. Next slide. After you've located your EVSE or electric vehicle supply equipment chargers on the map, you're going to want to go and figure out whether your transformers and service panels can accommodate these chargers as currently planned. So there's first a question that's, would you like to install a new transformer regardless of existing capacity? If you do that, you just move on, you drop that transformer wherever you would like it to be. However, if you want to tap an existing transformer, you're going to need to plug in some information. And so that's going to start with the transformer rating and the secondary voltage rating, which are typically, at least in DoD installations, found on the transformer. If not, they can also be found in electrical diagrams, or if you've got a site facility manager, they should have some record of that information. The next part is existing peak load. And for this, ideally, you have meters on your transformers that can tell you what the peak load is of those transformers over the past 12 months. If you don't have that, you might not be able to answer this question. In which case, without sending somebody out on site or doing some calculations based on electrical diagrams, you probably aren't going to know ultimately whether that transformer can support the new charging stations or not. So that's something that is often a hang up as part of these site assessments, and you can absolutely reach out to us to help work through that question right there, or you can just go back and for the purposes of this site assessment, what you're doing in generating a cost estimate, you can say, yeah, sure, I'm going to install a new transformer regardless of existing capacity. Next slide. You are going to do the same thing with your service panel. There is an initial question, which is, would you like to install a new service panel regardless of existing capacity? And this is often going to be the case that you'll want to install a new service panel for various reasons. One of them is that you can meter the service panel separately. Another one is that the existing service panel might not be in a location that you would like it to be. However, there are a lot of times when folks are installing just one or two charging stations. And from a cost perspective, it absolutely makes sense to tap the existing transformer and the existing service panel, just already run through the service panel. You're going to save yourself quite a bit of work and quite a bit of time. So we ask these questions and we start with the voltage rating to make sure the service panel is compatible with the charging station. Then we ask you whether there are any unused circuit breaker spaces. And you probably can't really see this picture too well, but if you zoomed in on it, you'd be able to see that it identifies some of the existing panel spaces, breaker spaces as spares, and it also identifies some spaces where you might see a blank plate there instead of any sort of circuit breaker. You're going to identify both of those as spaces for the purposes of the EVI-LOCATE tool. You're also going to provide the current rating of the overall service panel, so the main breaker current rating. And then you are going to need to identify the existing peak load, because there are really two questions when it comes to using an existing service panel. One is there sufficient space? So are there breaker positions that you could use? And then the second question is whether there's a electrical capacity. And that's where that existing peak load comes in. Again, very helpful to have some meter data on your service panel in order to calculate this. You can also do the calculation with electrical diagrams, or you can actually add up the breaker positions, and there's a way, if you've got an electrician on staff, that they can run a fairly simple calculation. It does require a little bit of background knowledge in order to identify whether the service panel can support new EVSC. This is another area where you can clearly reach out to us for a little bit of support. Next slide. Then you go ahead and connect the dots. So the tool is going to identify the low cost line from the transformer to the service panel to the chargers. Again, it's identifying the hardscape and softscape as part of this process. So this is where you get the picture of what your design's going to look like. And you'll be able to export this and use this in other ways as well. Next slide. The other thing you're going to get is a cost estimate. But in order to dial in the cost estimate, you do want to do a cost adjustment. And so we've got these project costs in here, the 20% contingency. I believe our base tax rate is 7 or 8%. However, you might want to adjust that down to 0% because this is the federal government and we are often tax exempt. You also want to incorporate in here the overhead percent associated with this, the profit, the bonds, and permitting as applicable. All of these are defaults that you're looking at right now besides the tax percent, and you are able to change these and slide these up and down as you deem appropriate. And on the next slide here, you're going to see that's going to generate a very detailed cost assessment. So we've got this waterfall graph, and we've actually recently combined some of these things because it's so detailed as to be a little bit challenging to read and to line up with the invoices that we've seen coming through the field. However, you can see the costs are sort of broken up into the charger costs themselves, and then the transformers and electrical equipment, all the construction costs such as bollards and wheel stops, painting, etc. Then the project costs themselves in gray. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that those are rolled up at a high level into these buckets: electrical, EVSE, project costs, and construction. And that 85,900 is obviously not going to be an exact cost. It's an estimated cost. It's what we think the cost is going to be, including a 20% contingency. So it is likely that costs would come in a little bit lower than that. However, they might come in a little bit higher as well. It's basically a number that a facility manager can go to somebody with and say, this is our government cost estimate. This is how much we're going to need for this particular project, give or take. Let's go ahead and put this out to bid. The other thing that we provide as part of this, and this is particularly helpful if your staff, if you have the staff that's capable of installing these charging stations and performing the electrical upgrades yourselves, and that's going to be a component list. So it's going to identify things like how many circuit breakers you need, how much EMT or other sort of conduit you might require, what kind of conductors you would need. Things along those lines are all identified as part of this component list. Next slide, please. There's also a dashboard so that you can look at this from a higher level, and it's going to be organized by agency. So you'll only be able to see within Army if you're part of the Army, although folks at OSD will be able to see all of these services, as well as the smaller defense agencies, which have their own bucket as part of this. Next slide, please. We're also generating a narrative. So it's automatically generated, and you should look at this and verify that this is correct. This is your plan. But this sort of written narrative can be used for construction planning. For example, there's a narrative portion of the DoD Form 1391, and you would be able to input some of this information here. So I've cut this down to a size that hopefully is legible on you guys' laptops. But basically, it's going to identify how many vehicles you're planning on supporting, which site, what location, like where exactly that is in terms of a town, and state, how many chargers, how many total ports, and then what your transformer is going, what sort of transformer you're going to need, as well as a service panel and the voltage that should be associated with both of those on the secondary side of the transformer. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of benefits from using this tool. The way it's organized is that anyone with a .gov or .mil email address that is associated with that particular agency will be able to create a username and password. People within a given service will be able to modify designs. Those designs can be subjugated to archives with notifications to the author. We are going to know who completed which design and what email address that is associated with. So we sort of have the capacity to track all of that information. There's also going to be a dashboard with sites and bases assessed, as well as EVSE ports planned by power level and the estimated cost. The web location for this is going to be NREL hosted with DOE support and oversight. Next slide. This is a combined project with funding from both DOE, particularly on the civilian side, and DoD more on the defense side. Next slide, please. The tool is also scalable nationwide. So you can see in our little neck of the woods, we have run a whole bunch of test sites around my office where I'm sitting right now. And this is going to give us a way to scale the EVSE designs throughout the United States. So it's going to be, I believe, hugely beneficial at the agency level if this is the tool that folks are going to be using. We will allow contractors to use it as long as they get permission from the agency folks with authority to grant it. Next slide. In terms of benefits to the Department of Defense, process simplification is a big part of that. This is going to guide users through the questions. Users will still be responsible for completing the designs, as I've outlined today. The embedded calculations are quite helpful. So we do a lot of math on the back end in terms of power loads and phases and electrical engineering. We also incorporate the National Electrical Code. So there are a bunch of requirements associated with that in terms of overcurrent protection, things along those lines, as well as conductor and conduit sizing. We calculate the trenching distances using identifying whether things are hardscape versus softscape, as well as the conduit and conductor distances, and then estimate the cost. There are also organizational opportunities that I've alluded to, the ability to track EVSE plans and designs and estimate costs by project and base. Next slide. EVI-LOCATE is, unfortunately, it is available at evi-locate.nrel.gov, but it's only available for people with NREL accounts right now. So Tim, if you still have access, you might be able to log in there, but otherwise it's not quite available yet. And I will get the word out as soon as this does clear all of our approvals and is available and accessible to .gov or .mil email addresses, or again, specific approvals for individual contractors. The tool outputs are the high-level site design, the government cost estimate, and the project narrative, as well as a parts list. And the organizational opportunities are to view the designs at bases, service-wide, or DoD-wide. Next slide. We could not have done this alone. We actually partnered with Frank Holcomb and his group at SERDP, is part of the Army Corps of Engineers. We also partnered with some colleagues from the Naval Information Warfare Center and the Marine Corps Installation Command. Our subcontractor on this project was Geodecisions, which is one of the leading GIS companies, and they've built in a lot of the special capabilities in here. Bring a lot of expertise to the table in terms of data analytics, fleet management, electrical engineering, geospatial programming, and web tool development. And as I mentioned before, this project is co-funded by ESTCP and DOE. Specifically within DOE, it's the Federal Energy Management Program, for whom we perform a lot of work, and they've been gracious supporters of this tool and getting the word out as well. And I believe with that, I am done. Feel free to email me at cabell.hodge@nrel.gov if you have any questions. My phone number is there as well. So feel free to reach out, and I would be happy to add you to the distribution list for EVI-LOCATE when it does go live. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cabell. We do have a number of questions for you. And at this time, I would also like to remind our audience that you can ask questions. and submit them by using the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. So the first question is that our audience would like to know if you have an expected timeline for the approvals that are needed for the tool to go live and be available for use in the DoD.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to say because I thought that it would be done by the end of September last. So I would love to say the end of October, but I would just caveat that by saying my last estimate was wrong. So take that as you will. We're pushing it through as quickly as possible, but we have to make sure it is it's secure and meets all the requirements.
Sure. Okay, sounds good. Makes sense. Next, does the cost estimation tool include design and coordinating with utilities?
It does not include the cost of design, so it is the cost of installing the charging stations. Part of the idea of this tool is it's supposed to reduce the cost of design, so you'll actually be able to export this and use it, in your design drawings. And then the cost of coordinating with utilities is not necessarily in there. I will say that this is based on a whole bunch of invoices for projects actually completed. And so some of that sort of contractor overhead and profit, and we've actually renamed that to engineering and administration. That includes working with utilities. It doesn't necessarily include any utility upgrades. Those are very specific, and we do highly encourage you to reach out to your utilities early in the process. The exports from this design can actually be pretty useful to utilities so that they understand what exactly is required in the case of a service upgrade.
Okay, great. And we did have questions about the bases for the cost estimation. You mentioned invoices for installed projects. Is there anything else that it's based on, and are those values updated over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's based on a few different things. The first and clearest is the GSA cost of the equipment itself. So that's for the EVSE itself. Now, most of the electrical and construction costs come out of RS means. And so that is updated on an annual basis and adjusted to the local environment using the Army Corps cost adjustment factor. We have also reviewed over 1,000 invoices and made adjustments to some of the values, particularly on the project cost side, to account for our findings from those invoices. And then we've drawn in some information from a couple of other sources. I'm blanking on the one. It's a construction cost estimation booklet, and then also from working with some industry experts, in particular architectural and engineering firms.
Okay, wonderful, thanks. Do the costs include O&M costs or just the capital costs?
These costs only include the capital upfront costs. They do not include O&M, and yeah, they do not include O&M. Thank you.
Okay. Next, does the tool provide the ratio of vehicle to charger needs?
So EVI-LOCATE does not identify how many chargers you need at a location. However, we have another tool called EVI-Ratio, and that's exactly what EVI-Ratio does. So EVI-Ratio looks at telematics data, specifically trip data, how the vehicle is used and what sort of vehicle it is, identifies whether that vehicle is likely, so if it's gasoline vehicle, whether it's likely to transition to an EV in the next several years, and then identifies if that vehicle is used the same as the existing one, how many charging stations would be required. So for example, if you've got a fleet of 10 vehicles and based on our calculations, we think 7 of them are going electric soon. However, 4 of them are underutilized. Maybe we identify that only 5 level 2 charging stations are required. That tool also identifies what power level is required for those charging stations. So not just level 1, level 2 DC fast charging, but also whether a slow level 2 charger, or a medium or a fast level 2 charger is required.
Okay, great. And have you considered using wireless chargers in the tool?
Yeah, we have not built wireless chargers into the tool. We have considered it, and it is a thought for future expansion, but it's not on our immediate to-do list.
Okay. Next, we have a couple of questions about the extent to which the tool can be modified by the user. Could a user modify the cost estimates within the tool at all? And can the user modify the underground pathway, for example, if there are some utilities to be avoided?
Yeah, so good questions. And the user can modify the project costs, but not the electrical and construction costs. So for example, I believe we've combined contractor profit and overhead into site engineering and administration. And that is one of those slider bars that I was showing earlier that can be adjusted. The underground pathway, we have been working on setting that up so that it's modifiable. And we were running into some issues. So my guess is that the initial, well, yes, I can just say the initial version of the tool that rolls out in the next month or so is not going to have that in there, but we're working on it and trying to build that in. We've got some funding to continue development on the project, and that is actually at the top of our to-do list.
Okay. What are the ADA accessibility requirements for EVSE?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there is a technical assistance document available on ADA accessibility requirements. It's not a regulation at present, as most of the ADA requirements are. However, there's an ADA regulation in the works, so that's currently coming. But that technical assistance document identifies how many or in what situations ADA accessible chargers are required. And it's basically anything that is considered public facing. So that definitely includes public charging. It definitely includes charging for privately owned vehicles. And it's an open question whether that includes charging for government-owned vehicles. There are some people who think that it does not, but there's some others who think it does.
All right. It's interesting and a challenge, it sounds like. All right, and I think we have one last question for you. Keppel, the tool that you were showing, I think, produced a dashboard and of other locations. Can you indicate which metrics are included and used by EVI-LOCATE to share with other users?
Yeah, so by other users, you are only sharing internal to the agency, and otherwise, school administrators, we have some access as well. But that's going to show you the total number of EV chargers, the total number of sites that have been assessed. It's going to show you the chargers by level 1, level 2 DC. Right now, it shows total number of transformers and total number of service panels, and we're putting in the costs, the total costs as well into there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the interesting presentation and answering the questions. And a reminder to our audience that Keppel will come back at the end of the webinar to answer more questions. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, and that is Frank Holcomb, a senior researcher in the energy branch of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineer Research and Development Center Construction Engineering Research Laboratory in Illinois. As part of the senior technical staff of that energy branch, Frank assists in identifying and cultivating new areas of energy and sustainability research to support Army and DoD requirements. He has over 30 years of experience leading energy and sustainability technology projects and programs, and is a recognized expert on fuel cells and Army power and energy issues. He earned a bachelor's degree in engineering physics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a master's degree in engineering management at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is currently earning his doctoral degree in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Frank, please go ahead with your talk.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can I do an audio check quickly, please?
It sounds great.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks, Cabell, for that very excellent and detailed presentation. My presentation is going to be on a little bit higher resolution, and it's on the results from an installation non-tactical vehicle fleet electrification tabletop planning exercises that we did at a few military installations. Cabell kind of talked about this, where teams have gone out to installations and other sites and looked at the planning, how many vehicles that the installations and sites have existing, how many are they going to transition in the next few years to meet the requirements, how many chargers do they need, what types of chargers, all of these sorts of things at a higher level. And with military installations, there's a few nuances that I'll go through. Sorry. As far as the outline, it's pretty straightforward. I'll go through some background on objectives. We have an analysis framework that we were using for this project. We have some Army and Navy sites that I'll talk about and some of the results from there, some additional research that we did as part of this project, conclusions, benefits, and acknowledgements. Of course, with the government and DoD in particular, there's lots of acronyms. This is probably an incomplete list, but for reference, if you're to download this presentation later, you'll have it, and I'll try and spell out things the first time I use them. So the reason that we're having this webinar in particular, and Cabell went through some details, and these planning exercises really goes back to the executive order that came out in 2021. And this is a subset. There was a lot of things in there, but basically it wants the federal government to lead by example to get to a carbon-free electricity sector, and basically in the operations of the federal government. So the underscore here talks about 100% zero emission vehicle acquisitions by 2035, including 100% zero emission light duty vehicle acquisitions by 2027. So there's a couple things here. One is we've been talking about battery electric vehicles. Battery electric vehicles are, by definition, depending on where the electricity comes from, can be zero emission. There are also fuel cell vehicles that are out there. You can currently buy them in California. They've been under development for quite some time. Those are electrochemical devices and by definition are zero emission as well. But the focus really is on what's available now and today in the near future. So this is going to be on battery electric vehicles and the electric vehicle charging equipment that Cabell talked about. Light duty vehicle, as defined here by 2027, are vehicles that have a gross vehicle weight of 8,500 pounds or less, and the medium and heavy duty vehicles are above that. So the focus right now to get to that 2027 timeline is on the light duty vehicles, and then by 2035, the rest of them. And these are non-tactical vehicles. So here are some of the objectives. We looked at 2 DoD installations, 1 Army, 1 Navy, to validate some of the planning process, some of these high-level things that I talked about, and document questions and concerns. As you can imagine, this is kind of new. It's kind of a big experiment for everybody. And even though this particular presentation is talking about the Department of Defense, that executive order covers the whole federal government. You can think about the General Services Administration, Department of Homeland Security, the Postal Service, Border Patrol, National Park Service, all these federal agencies, of which Department of Defense is but one. I think across the whole federal government, there are something like 650,000 vehicles. So it's not a small task, and you can imagine how complex, and even from Cabell's presentation, all of this planning and implementation and transition can be. The second bullet talks about potential funding sources. And of course, there's a cost for this transition, for the charging equipment, for the vehicles, for the operations and maintenance and other considerations. And with any stretch goal, I think there's always opportunity for innovative solutions and creativity to come out of this. So there's, I think, a lot of entities, non-federal entities, are looking at this and thinking how can they get involved? How can they come up with something creative to help the Department of Defense and the federal government writ large do all these things? We are also charged with documenting lessons learned and looking at best practices and evaluating zero emissions ground maintenance equipment opportunities. That's something else a little bit different that I'll talk about. I did want to pause just for a moment and give a few definitions. When we're talking about military installations in this context, we're really talking about large, semi-permanent, permanent facilities, not like a single facility like the Pentagon, and not like a remote site that you might stand up to do a short-term mission and then pick up and leave. These installations are like small cities. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of facilities that include dining facilities, barracks buildings, office buildings, schools, even, you name it, we've got it at a DoD installation. And also there's some mission-specific types of facilities, as you can imagine. Those are usually contained in what we call the cantonment area, or the main area of the installation. And then there are very vast, large expanses of space where training occurs. So training ranges and other places where the soldiers do their mission and train. These include large expanses of land, so it's good to put the context there as far as installations, quite large and have some different requirements that you or I might have as consumers with a battery electric vehicle. The vehicles themselves, you'll find sedans, light pickup trucks, 4x4 trucks, vans, shuttle buses, different specific types of motor pool equipment or motor pool vehicles. Again, we're talking about non-tactical vehicles here, and the focus right now is on those light duty vehicles, 8,500 pounds and less. So think about sedans, F-150 Lightning or pickup trucks, those types of things. And then another aspect here that I wanted to pause and just bring to light is that with these installations being so large, there are many tenant organizations at the installations who have fleets of vehicles. That tends to be a challenge because there is no single fleet owner, generally speaking, for these installations. So you may have the Public Works Department with their vehicles, you may have Morale, Welfare, and Recreation with their vehicles, several other different tenants with their own vehicle fleets, all needing to meet these requirements, all needing chargers and the associated equipment, and all impacting the installation as a whole with the energy usage that's required by those chargers. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody has the context there. I do want to point out too that I'm with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Engineer Research and Development Center, Construction Engineering Research Laboratory. So we're one of 7 laboratories that makes up the research organization of the Corps of Engineers. We had a partner here, the Naval Facilities Engineering Command, Engineering and Expeditionary Warfare Center, EXWC, out of Port Hueneme. A great group of folks. It shows that the Army and the Navy, and of course all services, can work together, but they were our partner with this project. As far as an analysis framework, we fell back to a little bit of a military term here, .milpf, .mlpf. It's really a framework that is well understood by the military when analyzing a new capability or an existing capability. As you can see from that equation, any new capability, let's say looking at planning for electric vehicles, this is a function of the things in the parentheses: doctrine, organization, training, material and equipment, leadership, personnel, and facilities. There's a subscript of T there, which just means that these things can change over time. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but it's very well largely encompassing all the different attributes that you may want to look at when analyzing a new capability. Especially think about personnel and training and the types of people that you need and their background experience. There is a human element to this as well, because everything is really so new with this effort. This table, if we start with that .mil-PF framework, we can kind of boil things down into 3 areas: technology, a business case and economics, and policy. Again, I'm not going to read through everything on the slide. You'll have these for reference, but think about the technology. Cabell talked about the charging equipment, the chargers, level 1, level 2, level 3, different types of chargers, different power requirements, different charging capabilities from slower to faster charging. But there's other things as well. Cybersecurity, again, I think Cabell touched on this, but within the federal government, the Department of Defense, cybersecurity is very important. We have strict requirements with how data is transferred and stored. And if we want to remotely meter or read data from these systems, we have to follow all of these requirements. On the technology side, I will also point out that there are some grid-independent chargers out there. And that is a major concern that most people have, is how, if I start putting all of these chargers on my electric grid, how is that going to impact my grid? Will I even have enough capacity to do that? And how much is it going to cost? So those are things. On the other, again, economics plays into this. Who pays and maintains the equipment? Sometimes we have contractors who own our distribution systems, and they in turn will incur a cost and pass it on to us in the DoD and the tenant organizations. And then on the policy side, what things can we inform policy to help expedite the transition to zero emission vehicles, and doing this in a smart and methodical way? So again, some of the goals here were to identify the charging sites and numbers of chargers, looking at the vehicles in the existing fleets and how they will be transitioned. A lot of these vehicles are leased from the General Services Administration, or GSA. These leases tend to be longer than what you or I on the consumer level might see. They tend to be 7 to 10 years. So the executive order doesn't mean you have to terminate a lease in order to meet that requirement by 2027, but it does mean that if you are terminating a lease or getting a new vehicle, it has to be replaced with a zero emission vehicle. The funding is always a challenge. What funding mechanisms? How can we leverage other types of funding, or can we in fact get leverage funding from the private sector potentially for this? Identifying best energy management practices. Should we charge all the vehicles at night? Or if there are different schemes that we can use for different types of vehicles, how can those be employed? And implementation, both the fleets and the privately owned vehicles. So the executive order and the implementation guidance does allow for privately owned vehicles to use those chargers at government installations. However, government vehicles always get the first right to use those. And if you have your own privately owned vehicle and you use that charger, you have to pay for it. It's unfortunately no such thing as a free lunch here. I'm going to go through some of the findings that we had at our installations. For this particular Navy installation, we looked at 10 different sites where we were going to put chargers or plan for chargers. And we looked at a number of different charging stations that are available. On the right-hand side is one of those grid-independent chargers that I mentioned. This one has a solar canopy. It has batteries in the base of that solar canopy. So it's a nice solution that you don't need to connect to the electric grid. You can put it in remote areas. However, it is not the most powerful charger that you can buy, so it will not charge vehicles as fast as a grid-connected charger in some cases. And you do need good solar resources for this to use. But again, this is something that the DoD is evaluating. They're implementing this at a number of sites, and it will go in with a mix of the wired chargers. We reviewed case studies with similar characteristics of this particular site with the Navy to identify best energy management practices. And at this particular site, kind of interesting, they had some concerns about explosives and energetics. Remember, I mentioned training areas, and often in remote sites. At this site, they were concerned about siting chargers close to or in proximity to some of the ordnance that they have in the ranges, or whether those vehicles, how close could they even get? Again, the electric vehicles and the chargers are kind of new, and whether based on actual data or not, there are still some concerns and some things that we needed to look into. The Army installation that we went to in Texas, we found some other aspects here. In this particular site, they have a contractor that owns their distribution system, and then there is a separate supply company that supplies electricity to the installation. They also cover some different municipalities because of the size of this installation, and that presented some challenges. If the contractor who owns the distribution system wanted to do some things, again, there are some limitations that they have. The second bullet is kind of particular to Texas in general. The Electric Utility Commission here has a 2 megawatt generation limit per a PUC regulatory act, which limits the amount of electricity entities can generate on site. So again, that has some repercussions, along with the fact that this contractor owns the distribution system, that have to be taken into account when you field these chargers. There are some concerns about high temperature here as far as negatively impacting the chargers, not necessarily the vehicles, but the chargers themselves that sit outside and are exposed to the weather day in and day out. One recommendation was that they install canopies over the chargers to get some of that solar radiation off of them, or directly off of them. And then at this site, they wanted some signage indicating that the chargers were for government use only. I think there's a handful of military installations that are allowing privately owned vehicles to use the chargers, but for now, the majority of them are just in the scramble to transition, get chargers installed, transition their vehicles, and the POV guidance will come later. As far as some recommendations here, so you can imagine this is a big endeavor at each installation. Doing a multi-year phased and incremental approach is the best. This transition is not going to happen overnight, and it will only happen if it's done methodically and, again, going through and looking at lessons learned. I mentioned about the electrical load and capacity, where it is unknown whether some of the sites can support that. Load analyses will need to be done. I think in some cases, when the installations were initially put in and new construction put in, there's usually a conservative factor with building in extra capacity. But adding these different loads, it's unknown at this point. So in the case where the contractor owns the distribution system, they know their system very well and can speak to capacities. But in some cases, you have to look at this. I mentioned in the third bullet here about the grid independent solar chargers. This is kind of a stopgap in areas that lack infrastructure. And I think that's a good alternative to use, again, in some remote sites. Based on their limitations, again, taking that into account still is a good opportunity to use those. And level 3 chargers, these are the ones that charge the fastest. They also consume the most electricity, or they have the highest power requirements. These are the ones where if you have vehicles like a police car or an ambulance or a fire truck, you don't really know what the use case of that vehicle is going to be on a day-to-day basis. So you might have to use it several times a day. You need a fast charger for those types of applications. Other ones, you may be able to plug those in overnight and leave them, but for those particular types of vehicles, you're going to need a level 3 charger and that supporting infrastructure because of the power requirements. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about grounds maintenance equipment. Now, you may scratch your head a little bit and ask, why are we talking about grounds maintenance equipment? The executive order does cover pretty much everything at a federal installation that has an internal combustion engine or burns fossil fuel. And if you think about grounds maintenance equipment, I have some pictures there that go around the perimeter of this slide. The top right is a chainsaw going to a leaf blower, a hedgehog, or weed whacker, snow blower, front end loader, etc. A lot of these, most of them use internal combustion engines, and there is a desire to transition these to zero emission. And again, that's going to be battery electric in this case. Don't think fuel cells are quite ready for these yet. And what are the impacts here? How is that going to affect things? So part of this was really to identify the number and types of grounds maintenance equipment that the installations have, and what are their performance requirements. I didn't mention it previously, but there are some specialty equipment that, for the most part, are going to need to get an exemption from the executive order because there may not be a commercially available zero emission equivalent that has the same performance characteristics. So part of this is really to look at what's available now or near term from the commercial sector that you can buy and what can be transitioned. That's part of the second bullet. The third bullet here is, well, what are the technology, the economic, and the policy challenges for implementing these, similar to what we did with the zero emission vehicles. Some of the findings from the grounds maintenance equipment is that most of the sites use contractors who use their own equipment. A lot of the sites will do some of their own grounds maintenance, specifically in morale, welfare, and recreation, think golf courses and facilities like that. But for the most part, it's contracted out. California is a progressive state in a lot of ways, and they have their own reference list of manufacturers that carry this zero emission ground maintenance equipment, or ZEGME as we call it. So some of the results that we found from an informal survey of a few sites, that this grounds maintenance equipment includes tractors, mowers, trimmers, the things that I mentioned previously. Watercraft at one site was mentioned, so they use boats in some of the training areas because there are ponds and lakes where the soldiers train, and part of that equipment to manage that training, the training ranges, is by boat. So that is a potential for transition as well. If there are existing contracts for this work, and if they need to be renegotiated, it's very likely that contractors will increase the costs. It's an unknown, and you can imagine if you put yourselves in the shoes of a contractor, if you were given this requirement, you may have to change out your equipment. How are you going to charge that equipment? Do I need extra batteries? Do I need extra training for people? All of these things. And again, California is creating its own requirements for this grounds maintenance equipment, zero emissions, and most smaller new equipment will be required to be zero emission. So some overall conclusions from both of these efforts is that, look, all federal agencies are facing challenges in planning for and meeting the requirements of the executive order. The Department of Defense has its own set of unique challenges, along, of course, with some of the other federal agencies. But the DoD in general has many tenant organizations with their own fleets of vehicles, no single overall fleet owner, very expansive ranges with remote areas, a lot of different mission considerations for what this equipment has to do. Think about 4x4 trucks that need to go in remote and rugged areas, that sort of thing. And all of this underlying the cybersecurity requirements. How are we going to collect all of this data and transmit it and store it? The problem we have, or one of the major challenges we have right now, is just that there's insufficient data and experience with this equipment, with the electric vehicles and with the chargers. And ultimately, that's leading to, in some cases, suboptimal planning because we don't have all of that data. And some of the, again, recommendations here, as we all go through this big experiment, if you will, we should all be sharing data, best practices, and lessons learned so that as we go through this and each subsequent effort will get better and more efficient. So hopefully private industry is looking at this. I know they are, and they can help us out as well. There's a lot of innovation and creative solutions out there, and we just need to tap into them. So some of the benefits, again, that going through these tabletop planning exercises will assist other DoD installations as they're going through and developing lessons learned to help facilitate this implementation and transition. We're also looking at how can we inform, or how can we help inform potential policy to drive different things. One example might be a planning, there are obviously a lot of planning commissions and master planners throughout the installations, but no single fleet owner. Perhaps that's something that could be enacted, if even temporarily, to help get an installation's arms around all of the requirements. And as I've kind of foot-stomped here all along, I think these efforts help facilitate public-private partnerships by raising awareness of what these requirements are, the unique requirements and challenges that the Department of Defense specifically has, and how non-federal stakeholders can bring innovation and novel business practices to the government. I do want to give some acknowledgments. Thank you so much to SERDP and ESTCP for funding this project. Cabell Hodge and NREL have done a lot of great groundbreaking work in this whole area for the entire federal government. So we've been very fortunate to partner with them on several efforts. So thank you, Cabell. And all of the stakeholders that we've worked with at DoD partner installations, they all have day jobs. They all have things that they're doing. This was another duty as assigned to help us gather information, sit down with us to go over these requirements, kind of pick their brains to see what good ideas they had to go forward. And lastly here, I did want to acknowledge some of our specific project team members within the Corps of Engineers. We had a couple of other Corps of Engineers agencies working with us. And so I'm with SERL, one of our research organizations with the Army Corps of Engineers under the Engineer Research and Development Center umbrella. And that's Stumpf and Harold Sanborn are also in our organization at SERL. Marianne Anderson is with Baltimore District Corps of Engineers. Megan Hoover was with the Wilmington, North Carolina District Corps of Engineers. Brianna Barr was a student intern working with us at SERL for the last couple of years. I mentioned the Navy partner and Naval Facilities Engineering Command, Expeditionary Warfare Center, Dave Cook, John Brito, Sarah Mendez. We had a contractor working with us doing excellent work. They've had a lot of military and installation experience. SCB Consulting and their staff, and Paragon Solutions was also a subcontractor that's done a lot of work at military sites. Some additional resources that I've cited, we largely used a planning framework that NREL developed that I've cited here. You can download it there, and step by step how to do these types of things at a higher level. And also the .mil-PF framework. There's a great paper out there. You can download that as well to learn more about how that capability analysis is done with the .mil-PF framework. So my contact information is here. Please reach out to me with any questions or comments. And I think we've got a short Q&A session right now. Thank you.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Frank. First, we've had a number of questions about additional types of vehicles and considering them. Were electric versions of golf carts or e-bikes or utility task vehicles considered as options to potentially mitigate some of the issues that you talked about, like budget and charging infrastructure?
To be honest, we talked about some of those things, but the focus was really on more of the sedans, the light trucks, that sort of thing. There's a lot of, I'll just say, a lot of planning efforts going in right now to military installations because they are so large, to put like facilities together to help alleviate that sort of thing, make more things walkable, for example, or having an e-bike or a scooter, having the distances from, say, the barracks to the dining facility, those in closer proximity. But yeah, the short answer is no, we did not specifically look at those types of things with this effort.
Okay, and what about fuel cell vehicles for the types of vehicles that you did consider? Have you looked further on to those beyond battery electric vehicles?
Sure, so fuel cell vehicles have made some good strides in the last few years. And California in particular, my understanding is if you are in California, you can actually buy a fuel cell vehicle. there was a time when you were not able to buy a fuel cell vehicle. They were only for lease or for demonstration purposes. California also has some hydrogen infrastructure in place. Right now, it's kind of relegated to special places like California or perhaps a handful of other sites where there are fuel cell vehicles that you can buy commercially, and the hydrogen infrastructure, the stations, if you will, to refuel them that are available. So we're not quite there yet. And maybe as time goes on, and again, with more commercial development and purchase of these vehicles, that they'll be more ubiquitous, but they're just not out there now for the DoD installations writ large.
Understood. Is the Army or DoD investigating the electrification of tactical vehicles yet at all?
Yes. So the 2022 Army Climate Strategy has a goal of converting the tactical vehicle fleet to electric by 2050. Of course, this will have some exceptions, I would imagine, if you think about very large and heavy vehicles, an Abrams tank, if you will, or other things like that. There may be some hybrid approaches, but that is a stated goal in the Army Climate Strategy by 2050. There obviously, if the military is going to invest in something like that for a tactical vehicle, there are obviously advantages to doing so. It's not just would be about just being green or reducing carbon. One could think about silent watch capabilities where you could shut down an engine and run in a silent mode, perhaps some longer run times for different missions, mission-specific things that would really be pushing the military. And on the other services too, with the Air Force and the Navy, you can think about all-electric ships, you can think about drones and aircraft. So there are obviously military advantages to doing that sort of thing. Otherwise, there wouldn't be those types of goals and requirements.
Thank you. This next question is from the Air Force Civil Engineering Center. Do you have any resource or reference or details about the DoD vehicle fleet that you might be able to share, like vehicle sizes, types, and overall size?
I do not. I know that CABL and NREL have been collecting a lot of information. They have a tool that they've sent out to most all federal sites to input their vehicle fleets. We have been working with individual installations and collected that data. So I don't have that higher level or order of data available. We have very specific data for the sites that we've gone to with regards to tenants and vehicles and the sizes and weights and that sort of thing, but nothing at a higher level.
Okay. And have you or others considered using mobile charging solutions in combination with the fixed chargers?
That's a great question, and thank you for that question, whoever asked it. It's something I probably should have brought up during this presentation. There are a lot of different things that the Department of Defense is looking at, and mainly because I think of this question of whether there's enough electric capacity to put in fixed chargers. So mobile charging, there are a number of mobile charging solutions out there, and I think that's a great idea along with the grid independent chargers. There's, again, it kind of gets back to the use case of the vehicles. I talked about installations that have very large and expansive ranges. If you drive your vehicle, electric vehicle, out 100 miles or 150 miles, you may not be able to get back unless you charge that vehicle, let's say overnight, with a level 2 charger. If you have a mobile charger, and again, with ranges where there may not be electrical infrastructure in place for a hardwired charger, if you have a mobile charger, that gives you a lot of extra degrees of freedom with what you can do. And I can even imagine on a consumer level that tow trucks will probably be mobile chargers at some point if someone happens to be run out of juice or electricity with their electric car and they need a quick charge. So that's a great question. That's something that all of these things I think are driving innovation, driving innovative solutions and creativity to come up with alternatives such as this, which could be employed.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question for you, Frank, before we bring Cabell back on the line. What policy changes or new policy do you think could be implemented to expedite and help make the transition to zero emission vehicles more efficient?
Yeah, I can speak to what we found at the installations we've gone to, and maybe some, I might say, personal opinions, not necessarily representative of overall policy, but I think that installations could benefit from having better visibility of their fleets, these individual fleets, which again is a challenge. Some of these tenants are permitted in installations. Some of them come in and out with units that come in and out and leave and are temporary. But some better visibility, I think, and maybe some policy that I'm not really advocating for another office, but perhaps some formalization of a different planning organization or something like that that could help out. That's probably one of the biggest things policy-wise that might be helpful, given that there's a lot of moving parts here. And as we've seen too, there's, with the zero emissions grounds maintenance equipment and even building electrification that is coming down the road, that's another requirement we didn't talk about today. This is only going to add to the loads, and some overarching, really far-reaching planning to see what is the landscape going to look like in 20, 30 years if we do all of this electrification. If there's some policy to, get a crystal ball and look at that, that would be helpful, because in some sense, I think we're planning towards an uncertain future at this point, and obviously that's suboptimal.
Understood. Thank you very much, Frank. And at this time, we'd like to bring Cabell back on the line. And the first topic that I'd like to discuss with both of you are cybersecurity requirements, which has come up in multiple comments and questions from the audience today. One audience member indicated that some installations are experiencing some pushback in moving towards EV fleets from their cybersecurity teams, with some teams requesting only hardwire monitoring control and financial systems be used, which is more costly. So first, Frank, would you address cybersecurity concerns, and are those risk assessments included in the tabletop planning?
Yeah, cyber is a tough one. It's a challenge that is not going to go away. And in some sense, it's a defensive challenge, because I don't know that one can ever get ahead of the game. It's a constant battle. And so the comment about hardwiring, that would be one way to do this. In some cases, third-party providers are providing the services to the military installations. That charging as a service is an option at this point. So putting the cyber requirements on a contractor, if you will, to collect data, monitor the usage of the chargers, have a secure website for the DoD personnel to get securely into and access that data, that is one potential solution. But again, they in turn have to follow our DoD cybersecurity requirements. That's a continuous challenge, but it is something that I think with more implementation and with the security people having a better understanding of what data is actually being collected and what safeguards need to be done, that I think will help facilitate things and maybe get some better guidance out as to how about implementing this. It's all very new right now, and that's part of the challenge.
Thank you. Cabell, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of conversation about cybersecurity requirements with regards to electric vehicle supply equipment, the charging stations, or the vehicle telematics. And on both sides, GSA is doing a pretty good job of requiring folks with cloud-based platforms to go through the FedRAMP process and requiring others to go through the NIST requirements and document them accordingly. To Frank's point, I think that's right. It's an ongoing challenge that's not going away. And so what you need for that is more of a process than any sort of silver bullet, so to speak. And so I think that what is taking place with GSA is appropriate and necessary. And I think it will just be important for folks with the Department of Defense to be aware of the cyber vulnerabilities, what they extend to and what they don't. For the most part, these charging stations aren't talking to other equipment on the DoD information network. And so they're mostly isolated. However, in the future, you could see more opportunities for base-wide smart charge management and bidirectional charging, which will inevitably open up communications to other operational technology. And so as part of that, enhanced cyber security requirements are going to be necessary to make sure that those. And sorry, I muted it at the end, but I think I was done anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one more question for Cabell. Can your tool do any estimation for medium or heavy duty EVs or non-road vehicles? And if not, is that something that's planned for the future?
Yeah, so it's just for the charging stations, and the charging stations used by medium and heavy duty vehicles tend to be the same. Or actually, I should mention this earlier in the presentation. I'm glad somebody asked about it. We're still working on incorporating DC fast charging into the tool. Right now, it's got level 1 and level 2. And so more of those medium and heavy duty vehicles are going to rely on DC fast charging than level 1 and level 2. So that is one limitation as it applies to that. The other tool actually that Frank mentioned, and if it's, and it looks like you guys were able to send this out, is the ZPAC tool, which is the zero emission vehicle planning and charging tool that's linked in the chat. That one looks at all the vehicles. However, it only looks, so including medium and heavy duty vehicles, but it only identifies the light duty vehicles or medium duty vans as good candidates because those are the vehicles that are currently available on market. So that's more of a vehicle based tool, and that one is more focused on the light duty side. However, EVI-LOCATE should work just fine for light, medium, and heavy duty, with the exception that we're still building in DC fast chargers.
Okay, wonderful. At this time, I'd like to thank both of our speakers for their excellent presentations. And then we'll talk just briefly about what's coming up next. The next webinar in this series is on Thursday, October 19th. And this webinar features DoD-funded research efforts on alternative coating and plating technologies for corrosion and repair. Registration is open for this webinar and other webinars, so please visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register. And before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation from today's session will be archived on the webinar webpage in case you want to refer to them in the future. And we would appreciate it if you could please just take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.